can't resist opening this video with a banal soundbite where I explain that VA-11 Hall A is actually supposed to be read as Valhalla, so let's just get that out of the way. VA-11 Hall A, hereafter known as Valhalla, bears a superficial similarity to Papers, Please, which intrigued me enough to give it a try. After wrapping up my stint as a bartender, I was left feeling that it could have benefited by following the example of Papers, Please more closely. I don't regret all of my time spent in Valhalla, but I did find its more traditional visual novel approach disappointing. Hopefully comparing it to Papers, Please will illustrate why. This video will contain plenty of details from both games, but I don't think there's much here that'll ruin your experience if you haven't played them yet. At a glance, the two have a lot in common. Both revolve around a kind of everyday job which isn't an obvious choice for a game. Although bartending and border control aren't exactly similar, they do ultimately focus on a client who needs to be served in some way. Each game advances day by day with the goal of earning enough money to survive by performing well at work. Even their approach to the user interface is quite similar, broken into permanently displayed segments with the customer only occupying part of the screen. In Papers, Please, the document window and map overview were fixed in place because they were integral parts of the experience. If you weren't constantly checking documents, you were doing something wrong. Early story events in the top panel are designed to catch you off guard because you're not paying attention to it. Later, it's integrated into the gameplay. To put it simply, every single area of the screen justifies its inclusion. The ever-present ingredient window might lead you to think that drink mixing would play a large part of Valhalla when really it takes a back seat to the dialogue. Drinks can't even be made outside of predetermined times where a menu takes over the main chunk of the screen. This leads to the obvious question of why the control panel isn't hidden from view until necessary as well. The cynical answer says that it's just a ploy to make screenshots look more interesting than they really are, while the optimistic viewpoint paints it more as an homage to older visual novels which inspired their retro appearance. The appeal of nostalgia is undeniable, but it becomes something of a problem when it obstructs progress. It's a pretty safe assumption that those older visual novels had large decorative borders to cover up technical limitations. The more space you could carve out of the screen, the smaller the character portraits and backgrounds had to be. The smaller they were, the more you could fit in storage, an important advantage in the days when memory limitations were measured in kilobytes. Of course, we live in the future, so the vast majority of the time the ingredient window, logo, menu and borders just waste valuable screen space for no good reason. Considering that one of the principal goals of Valhalla was to immerse the player in the comfortable atmosphere of a relatively quiet bar, it's disappointing that we don't actually get to see much of it. A wider view would have provided room for more background details with space for more characters. If that had been factored into the writing, it could have led to more unique interactions, like eavesdropping on a conversation in the background, or two characters who sit apart from each other until they strike up a conversation and move closer. As it stands, there's a lot of untapped potential in the main portion of the screen. While some things seem to exist just to take up space, the jukebox has the opposite problem. It's the one part of the user interface which is always relevant, but it's hidden behind the top right panel. This ability to change the music at any time actually stuck out to me as the most interesting feature of Valhalla above all else. At first, it seems a bit strange that random tracks play over these visual novel-style conversations, but over time it really grew on me. Many of the tracks seem to be composed with certain scenes in mind. If it were another visual novel, you could imagine the kind of scenario each one would accompany. Here's your exposition music, here's your tense music, here's your heartfelt confession music. In Valhalla, a character can be having an emotional monologue while a heavy dance track plays in the background, you know, the kind of thing that might actually happen in reality. The same kind of situation could be presented in a film. A director could choose clashing music for a certain scene, but in that case it would be an obvious, contrived decision which calls attention to itself. In Valhalla, it's pure chance when the jukebox makes an awkward choice, and you can even skip or pause it as you see fit. Of course, it makes no difference to the characters. As far as I can tell, they don't respond to the music at all, which I suppose is another one of my gripes, but in some small way, the jukebox helps to reinforce that cyberpunk theme of technology's indifference to emotion. These are the kinds of interactive touches I was hoping to see more of. Without them, Valhalla would be better presented through some other medium instead. Papers, Please starts out simplistic, but by day 3 of a month-long campaign it already has more complicated rules than Valhalla. At its core, it's just a fast-paced game of spot the difference where you try to earn as much money as possible by not messing up. It should be simple, but a seemingly endless number of regulations are gradually introduced which keep players on their toes. Nearly every single day there's some new twist on the formula, a new document to inspect, a new rule, an important story event, and so on. Failure will quickly get family members killed, which may just be a piece of text on the end of day screen, but if anything that actually enhances the atmosphere the game strives to achieve. The lack of fanfare when someone dies of a preventable illness implies it's not an uncommon occurrence, just another day in Arstotzka. Papers, Please is full of these kinds of small details that say a lot with very little. Whereas in Valhalla we go to work, in Papers, Please we walk to work, calling attention to the act of walking as if there's no other choice. The only autonomy you really have is in your job, where your decisions impact the people involved and lead to one of several major endings for your character as well. Part of the appeal of Valhalla is how little control you have over the other characters' lives, so I'm not going to hold that against it. After playing countless other games where the protagonist is at the centre of some desperate plan to save the world, it is refreshing to see a more relaxed take on things. For that same reason, I also won't complain that you have an unlimited amount of time to mix drinks, even though it would be reasonable to expect fairly prompt service once you've ordered something in a bar. It's clear the experience was meant to be enjoyed at a leisurely pace so you can soak in the atmosphere. That said, there's myriad other ways that drink mixing could have been expanded. Without a time limit, there's no incentive to learn recipes rather than just use the computer to look them up. Even just one moment where the computer is unavailable would have rewarded players for learning some common drinks. There's no penalty for getting orders wrong as long as you just press the reset button instead of serving it. Yeah, the components could probably be recycled, but surely there should be some minor cost associated with making that mistake. Even though there's no time limit, I found I got some drinks wrong anyway because I was rushing myself or not paying attention. Being punished for that would have been a valuable mechanic which added a little touch of realism. Several aspects of drink mixing go completely unrepresented. Many real-life cocktails have salt or sugar on the rim, which needs to be applied before the drink goes in because it requires you to turn the glass upside down. The glass itself is also an important part of the equation. A martini in a beer mug won't look very appealing and vice versa. Ice comes in several forms: blocked, cubed, cracked or crushed. The wrong type can turn one kind of drink into another. Sometimes ice is used during the shaking process but strained out while pouring. Garnishes such as mint leaves, lemon or lime can make a surprising difference to the overall taste, and for the finishing touch there's the option to add a straw and a little decoration. If you ask me, it's a real missed opportunity that you can't serve someone the manly drink they asked for with a little pink umbrella on the side. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but the instructions seem to imply that they were more complicated at one stage. Every recipe ends by saying all mixed, as though the mixing process could have happened at a different point or not at all, essential if you want something layered for that multi-colour look. Just bolting more elements onto the recipes wouldn't have made for compelling gameplay by itself, but combined with more customer preferences it could have been quite interesting. If a patron told you early on that they like a slice of lemon or prefer to drink everything through a straw, remembering that could have earned you better tips. Valhalla not only fails to flesh out its core concept, but it's as though it stubbornly refuses to do anything interesting at all with its premise. Even well into the story, after I had already given up caring about drinks and started viewing it more as a visual novel, it still managed to frustrate me with one particular scenario. On day 16, Jamie tells Ingram he should try a suplex if he likes bitter drinks. This made me instantly perk up, thinking I'd have to remember the drink for the next few minutes until Ingram decided to try one. Instead, Ingram just ordered one straight away, by name. At times like that, it's hard to remember why the drink mechanic even exists at all. Here's where Papers, Please becomes relevant again. Imagine you're working at border control, and as you let some guy through, he asks you to be kind to his wife who's next in line. When it's her turn, you realise she doesn't have enough documentation. The two of them are trying to emigrate, and she says she'll be killed if you send her back. You're now presented with a choice: you can let her in or keep her out. Some people will say this is a simple problem. No papers, no entry. Letting her through isn't fair to the other entrants. She could be lying about her situation, and breaking the rules will cost you a penalty. On the other hand, you're splitting up a married couple. You might even be sending one of them to their death. Her passport is in order, and if you've been performing well, the infraction won't cost you much personally. Thinking more selfishly, there's even a risk that the husband might try to take revenge on you if his wife gets turned away. There's a lot of variables at play, so many that you might even make a decision you regret later once you have more time to think about the potential consequences. Now imagine you're working at a bar where someone comes up to the counter and asks for a sugar rush. Not a difficult decision, is it? Papers, Please has a big advantage over Valhalla because it often tackles moral dilemmas, which are innately juicier decisions to make. When we play a game, any game, no matter how immersed we are in the moment, there inevitably comes a time when the journey is over and we go back to our regular lives. Even in games like Papers, Please, with so-called lasting consequences, people can die or disappear, but when it's all said and done, we know it's not for real. No game ever truly has lasting consequences because none of it ever really happens in the first place. This is the reason why moral choices are so compelling. A difficult ethical dilemma can stick with us even once the game is uninstalled. It can allow us to reflect on who we are, or at least who we wish we were. The choices you face as an Arstotzkan border control agent might make you think more carefully about how it feels to be trapped in a system beyond your control. Valhalla has the same premise, but it simply doesn't hit on the same level. To be clear, I'm not saying all story-heavy games need to focus on moral choices. Homogenization isn't a good thing in my book. If anything, I'm pointing out how Valhalla was fighting an uphill battle by not focusing on such things. In a way, I respect it for that, but that doesn't excuse how hollow the interactions feel. Without those moral incentives, the game struggles to ever give a good reason why you should deviate from your job of serving the customer exactly what they've asked for. Without an interesting decision to make, these moments are, at best, incredibly simple puzzles, or at worst, nothing more than a chore. There are a few exceptions, of course. When the delivery guy was scared of ordering girly cocktails, it was easy to read between the lines, but that's one of very few times I ever felt justified in ignoring somebody's order. Of course, you can try handing customers different drinks just to see what'll happen, but you never get a good excuse to do that. Normally I'd be the first to praise a game for trusting players to explore its systems, but for such a story-heavy experience I expect at least some in-game justification for me to do so. A small conflict of interest would have gone a long way. Something like a higher commission on unpopular promo drinks would have given players a pretext for messing up orders. Even if you do give up on trying to immerse yourself in the experience and start handing out random drinks for no reason, the outcome is rarely satisfying anyway. Give out too many simple drinks in a row and you'll at least get a game over, but single out one person for bad service and they're all too happy to continue downing stuff they never asked for, day after day, week after week. They'll keep coming back until their storyline plays out even if they've never once been served the right thing. Often this kind of experimentation just ends up revealing how blatantly the script course corrects itself. Try handing the underage girl something with alcohol and Jill actually takes the drink back just so the conversation can carry on as normal. The only comparable example of railroading in Papers, Please is Georgie, whose story always ends the same way. Even so, his dialogue on later visits will change depending on whether he was approved, denied, or detained previously. Despite the large number of situations and choices made in a single playthrough of Papers, Please, the game always seems to respond in an appropriate way. If you play perfectly up to day 10, you'll get a plaque for excellence instead of sufficiency, even though the vast majority of players will probably never see it, and just giving you a sufficiency plaque even if you were playing perfectly would have suited the game anyway. Continue that playthrough later into the month and one of the entrants that comments on the plaque will be impressed instead of dismissive. There's even semi-hidden events that can be triggered by handing certain characters certain items, and of course a whole multitude of endings that can happen under various circumstances. The worst you can do to break the game is intentionally let the clock run down on certain days, which will cause you to go into a sort of overtime until you process enough people. On day 6 you're forced to keep playing until you admit someone so the scripted event can trigger. While this might be a little cheap in its implementation, at least it was accounted for and feels mostly internally consistent. On the other hand, seeing Donovan, someone who won't even tolerate minor issues with his own staff, limply accept another wrong order undermines any sense of him being a real character. The unspoken agreement you enter into when you make a game with simplistic gameplay is that some other elements will pick up the slack. This video wasn't about Valhalla's quality narratively. My intent was to show how its interactivity is poorly utilised. I'm not going to critique specific characters or story arcs, but I will say that trying to defend Valhalla by saying it's just a visual novel doesn't do it any favours, because the drink mechanic clumsily derails the conversation every couple of minutes. The dialogue and pacing would almost certainly have improved without those constant interruptions, so the interruptions should be interesting enough to pay for themselves. In a visual novel, the kind of effort that would normally be spent creating new levels, enemies, abilities, and so on, can instead be spent on designing characters, polishing the writing, and planning for different branches. Valhalla fails to deliver on that promise by only doing the bare minimum to scrape by. I'm a believer in judging every game by its own merits, but that might be half of my problem with Valhalla in the first place. It seems like it didn't really know what it wanted to be, as though the developers didn't have the confidence to pick a direction and stick with it. As a result, it doesn't really have the benefits you typically see in a fully fledged game or in a visual novel. That isn't to say it's without merit entirely. At the very least, it has a unique premise compared to any visual novel I've ever seen, but it's stuck in a pretty dissatisfying middle ground. Maybe Sukeban Games never intended Valhalla to be anything like Papers, Please, and that's fine, but that doesn't mean there weren't lessons to be learned from that game anyway. Papers, Please is a great example of weaving narrative choice and gameplay together. Instead of selecting responses from a menu, you forge your path through the story using just the core mechanics. That's what I was hoping for from Valhalla, but by comparison it just tastes watered down.